Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 175 and it's titled Get Frogged, Nerd. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card you may have already seen because quite a few months ago, I think at this point, we actually built this deck on stream because I wanted to highlight some of the ways that I go into building the decks and how I choose the random cards. So our random card for the week is Diminisher Witch, and if you haven't seen the stream, I'll make sure to link that in the video. But Diminisher Witch is 2 and a blue for a 3/2 human warlock. She has Bargain, so we can sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token as we cast this spell. And then when she enters the battlefield, if it was bargained, create a cursed roll token attached to target creature an opponent controls. It's worth noting at this point that a cursed roll would turn any creature into a 1/1, and it is an aura. So with that in mind, we tried to find a couple of themes to build around. So when I mentioned that this was built on stream, I did have some help. I believe Doodle was there. I believe Richard may have also been there. If I'm forgetting anyone, I do apologize. But we got some great suggestions for what to put in the deck. But the main thing we were struggling with was the commander. There really wasn't a great commander for this deck at the time, so we decided to go with 2 commanders, a pair of partners, and include pretty much every color except red, because we are running Ishai, Ojutai Dragonspeaker, and Reyhan, Last of the Abzan. So Ishai is 2 white-blue for a 1/1 legendary creature bird monk. It's got flying. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Ishai, and then of course partner. And their partner is Reyhan, which is 1 black-green for a 0/0 human warrior. Reyhan enters with 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and whenever a creature you control dies or is put into the command zone, if it had 1 or more +1/+1 counters on it, you may put that many +1/+1 counters on target creature. Now, both of these cards look like they work well with +1/+1 counters, but admittedly that's not what we're trying to do here. Most of what we're trying to do revolves around the auras and the roll tokens, but we didn't have a lot of great options for commanders that fit these colors because you may notice these are the Atraxa colors, and Atraxa tends to be a little bit more expensive than these two. I also do want to point out that I personally have these 2 as a commander pair for a personal deck that I have. That one is a +1/+1 counter deck. So if anyone's interested in seeing that deck in the future and maybe how it's a little bit different from this one, let me know down in the comments and I would be happy to do a deck tech on one of my personal builds as well. So with that being said, let's move on to some of our themes for this deck. Now, as we've kind of already mentioned, the first theme is revolving around auras, and specifically, we are trying to look at auras that turn our opponent's creatures into base power and toughness 1/1, take away all their abilities, or just somehow make them worse. So the roll tokens do that for us, but we also have cards like Frogify, which is 1 and a blue for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a blue frog creature with base power and toughness 1/1. So there are a couple of different reasons we wanted to try to use these types of auras. The first is that they're surprisingly good removal because we can put this on a player's commander and their commander is not going to go back to the command zone, but it's also not going to have its abilities and it's not going to be much of a threat being only a 1-power creature. So this is great commander removal and prevents your opponents from recasting it. But it's also a good way to get rid of maybe some large attackers or some important combo pieces. Being able to take away abilities is incredibly important and comes up a lot more often than you may think. Moving on, though, to our next theme of the deck, that is going to be Enchantress. And specifically, we are looking at cards that can typically draw us more cards when either we cast an enchantment or have an enchantment enter under our control. So a good example of that is Eidolon of Blossoms, which is 2 green-green for an enchantment creature spirit. It's a 2/2 with Constellation. Whenever Eidolon of Blossoms or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Now, there are a lot of Enchantress effects that say when you cast an enchantment, draw a card, and we do play a ton of those as well because they trigger on things like Frogify, they trigger on some of our other enchantments that we have. But we really want to be focusing on the enchantments that draw us cards, specifically when an enchantment enters the battlefield. And that's because if we're using the roll tokens, so the cursed rolls from Diminisher Witch, we won't be able to draw cards because we're not casting them. So we really want to draw the cards from them. And the best way to do that is, of course, to make sure that they are just entering under our control. So once we've gotten to that point, we've cast all of our Frogifies, we've cast all of our Eidolon of Blossoms, we have a ton of auras, our opponents have 1/1 creatures, and we've drawn a ton of cards. Well, what do we do after that? And the answer is in our third theme, and that is wipe out our opponent's boards, because we have a ton of cards in this deck that specifically give creatures -1/-1, maybe -2. We want to take advantage of our opponent's creatures being incredibly small to make sure that we can effectively kill anything on board with just a cursed roll token. And a great example of that is with Curse of Death's Hold, which is 3 black for an enchantment or a curse. Enchant player. Creatures enchanted player controls get -1/-1. So if our opponent has a 50/50 creature, all we've got to do is put a Frogify on it, it becomes a 1/1, and then if they have Curse of Death's Hold on them, it gets -1/-1 and immediately dies. So no matter what our opponent's creatures have, we can just get rid of them, and because it's -1/-1, it doesn't care about indestructibility. Because Frogify removes all abilities, we can get rid of something with indestructible anyway. So this is just a way for us to really control the board and make sure that we are the only player at the table that still has access to their creatures. But those are all of our major themes for this deck. And so the next thing I want to do is take a look at some of the key cards in the deck. These are kind of like the MVPs, the most valuable, well, cards, I suppose, in the sense that they are combo pieces and value engines and some of the most efficient ways for us to win the game. The first key card we're going to talk about is going to be Grave Betrayal, which is 5 black for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you don't control dies, return it to the battlefield under your control with an additional +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step, and that creature is a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. So since we've already talked about how we really just want to be clearing out all of our opponent's creatures, we want to be killing as many creatures as possible, turning them into 1/1s, maybe blocking them, getting in with combat damage, that kind of stuff. Grave Betrayal is going to work incredibly well because we can take our opponent's creatures, turn them into 1/1s, and when they die, they're going to return under our control as their normal creatures. So if someone has a 5/5 monster of a creature, we can just turn it into a 1/1, kill it, and when it comes back, it's going to come back as a 6/6 because it's going to get a +1/+1 counter from Grave Betrayal, meaning essentially we can turn our opponent's own creatures against them and try to use their own win conditions so that we can win the game. Now, this is tough to get set up. It is 7 mana, but thankfully there's a lot of ramp that we have in the deck that's focused on enchantments, so it kind of plays into our themes. Moving on to our second key card. This one has become a recent favorite of mine. This is Asinine Antics. It is 2 blue for a sorcery. You may cast it as though it had flash if you pay 2 more, and for each creature your opponents control, create a cursed roll token attached to that creature. And another reminder, a cursed roll makes things a 1/1, so for 4 mana at sorcery speed or 6 mana at instant speed, we can make every single creature that our opponents control a 1/1. Now, that is just the face value of this card, because if we go back and remember Eidolon of Blossoms, which says that when an enchantment enters under our control, we draw a card, every single cursed roll that is entering attached to our opponent's creatures is entering under our control, meaning that if our opponents, say we have 3 opponents at the table, each of them just has 3 creatures, we turn all of them into 1/1s, and we draw 9 cards with Eidolon of Blossoms. So Asinine Antics really plays well with every other card and every other synergy in our deck, and if I'm being perfectly honest, is probably the most powerful card in our entire deck when compared with all of the synergies that we have. Moving on, though, to our next key card. This is another card that I have found myself putting in more and more decks. It is Nurgle's Rot, which is a black mana for an enchantment aura. Enchant creature an opponent controls. When enchanted creature dies, return Nurgle's Rot to its owner's hand, and you create a 1/3 black demon creature token named Plague Bearer of Nurgle. So, this is a lot of what we want to be doing. We are putting an aura on something, and it doesn't do anything to it. It just makes it have an aura on it. But what it's going to do for us is keep returning to our hand when that creature dies, giving us more enchantments to play, giving us more auras to cast, giving us more value for killing their creatures because we get 1/3 demons. So this, again, kind of does everything we want it to do, and it's a great way for us to keep accruing value over the course of the game just by doing what we want to be doing anyway. So those are all of our key cards, and the next thing I want to do for this deck tech is take a look at some cool interactions in the deck, and these are cards that synergize well together. In some cases can be combos, in some cases might be value pieces, but most of the time they're just going to be a combination of cards that I really want to highlight because, well, I think they're kind of cool. So the first cool interaction is Ardenn, Intrepid Archaeologist, and Imprisoned in the Moon. So Ardenn is 2 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature core scout. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may attach any number of auras and equipment you control to target permanent or player. Then it has partner. And so Imprisoned in the Moon is going to be an aura, so it can move around with Ardenn, and it's 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura. Enchant creature, land, or planeswalker. Enchanted permanent is a colorless land with tap, add a colorless, and loses all other card types and abilities. The reason I wanted to highlight this pair of cards in particular is because of the way that Ardenn is worded. You can move any number of auras and equipment you control to target permanent or player, meaning we can take Imprisoned in the Moon, put it on something that might be a problem at the time, and then eventually, if there's a bigger threat at the table, we can just move Imprisoned in the Moon to a different bigger threat, and then kind of keep clearing away whatever is the most concerning at the time. Plus, we can also use Ardenn to move around our cursed rolls, we can use him to move around our Frogifies, we can even use him to move around some of our land enchantment auras that make our lands tap for mana of any color or an additional mana or whatever. So that way we can use a bunch of mana in our first main phase and then move them in our second main phase and keep getting more mana out of it. Ardenn really is like an unspoken hero of this deck, but I really like how he plays with a lot of our removal because we can just move it around as needed rather than having to remove, say, a colorless land that's been enchanted by Imprisoned in the Moon. So that is, of course, cool interaction number 1. And moving into cool interaction number 2, we're going to have Boon of the Spirit Realm and Ancestral Mask. So one of the easiest ways for us to win the game is just by putting an enchantment or having an aura in play that's going to be giving our creatures +X for the number of enchantments we control. Boon of the Spirit Realm and Ancestral Mask are 2 of the strongest of those effects. So Boon is 3 white for an enchantment. It has Constellation, so whenever it or another enchantment enters under our control, put a blessing counter on Boon of the Spirit Realm. Then creatures you control get +1/+1 for each blessing counter on Boon of the Spirit Realm. So if we have 5 enchantments enter, it gets 5 counters. All of our creatures get +5/+5. Now, if we go and take a look at something like Asinine Antics and our previous example of each opponent having 3 creatures in play, that's 9 auras coming in. They all trigger Boon of the Spirit Realm. We get +9 counters on Boon, plus the 1 from it entering, so it's +10/+10 to every single creature we control. Then, in addition to that, we can put Ancestral Mask on one of our creatures, which is 2 and a green for an enchantment aura. Enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 for each other enchantment on the battlefield. Now, this is very important wording because this counts all enchantments, not just ours, it also counts our opponents. So if for some reason our opponents also have a bunch of enchantments, Ancestral Mask is giving +2 for each of them. It, of course, does not count itself, but ideally, with both of these cards combined, we should be able to very easily just kind of push our way through combat with just a single creature. And you've got to keep in mind, too, that one of our most effective win conditions is in the command zone with Ishai, because Ishai is going to be getting a +1/+1 counter every single time our opponents cast a spell, so we don't need that many counters from Boon, and we don't need that many enchantments with Ancestral Mask for Ishai to just start knocking people out of the game. And so, like I said, I wanted to highlight some cards I thought worked well together and that were cool, and I think these two kind of fit that bill. So, moving on, though, to the next piece of our deck tech, we're going to talk about the budget of the deck. And this week, the total deck price came in at $72.35, with the most expensive non-commander card, because unfortunately Reyhan is the most expensive, is Overwhelming Splendor. And Overwhelming Splendor at $6.19 definitely earns that price tag, because it is 6 white for an aura, curse, enchant player. Creatures enchanted player controls lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 1/1. An enchanted player can't activate abilities that aren't mana abilities or loyalty abilities. So being able to remove a lot of our opponent's win power is really what's going to help this deck, well, win. And if we don't have to put a Frogify on every single one of our opponent's creatures, we can just give them an Overwhelming Splendor and essentially knock a player out of the game, because now none of their creatures can do anything, none of their creatures have any power or toughness, and there's not much they're going to be able to do to stop us from that position. However, like I said earlier, it is $6.19, so if you did need to trim a little bit out of the deck to make sure that it fits a lower budget, you can cut Overwhelming Splendor in favor of some other minor enchantments that still do similar things but aren't quite as powerful and quite as expensive. So that is a suggestion, but if you have the budget space for it, I would highly recommend keeping it in, because it really does what we want to be doing. It is the perfect example of our game plan. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit outside of our budget range, I do have an example for you there as well. So this week, I would recommend putting in Hall of Heliod's Generosity, which is $7.22, and you can just take out a basic forest for it because it's just replacing a land. Now, I don't normally like to recommend lands as out-of-budget upgrades, because if you look at a lot of the mana bases we use for these decks, you'll see a lot of temples, you'll see a lot of bounce lands, you'll see a lot of basic lands. It's a lot of cards that don't cost a lot of money, so obviously I could always recommend, like, yeah, if you have shock lands, if you have fetch lands, go ahead and put them in. That will make the deck better. But I think this is kind of an exception to not recommending lands, because this is a very specific land. Hall of Heliod's Generosity is a legendary land that taps for a colorless mana, and you can pay 1 and a white and tap it to put target enchantment card from your graveyard on top of your library. So being able to rebuy all of our Frogify effects is incredibly important, because we are planning on killing our opponent's creatures, and if they die with an enchantment on them, we just kind of lose that enchantment forever, unless it's Nurgle's Rot, but that's again why it's an MVP card. But being able to get them back every single turn and essentially allow us to cast Frogify on a creature and then immediately kill it and then put it back on top, draw it, cast it again, gives us a lot of ways in the game to keep advancing our game plan, while at the same time making sure that we're always drawing a card that's relevant. And like I said, if you're going to put it in, you do have to replace a card. I would recommend just a basic land, because you probably don't want to pull out a dual land for the Hall, given that it taps for colorless, and a dual land would, tap for more than one since we're a 4-color deck. But that would be just my suggestion. Obviously, you don't have to do this if you would like the more consistency of having the colored mana, but I do think Hall of Heliod's Generosity is very much worth it. Now, before we move on to the gameplay, because now that we've talked about the deck, we do have to see how the game actually works out for the deck. We have to see how it can perform. Before we get to that, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So you can check us out on Twitter, Reddit, send me an email, and of course you can find us over on Patreon and right here on YouTube as a channel member. If none of that is your style, I completely understand. You can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. My goal for this year is to hit 1,500 subscribers by the end of the year. I think we can do it, but I would love your help in getting us there. So double check for me. If you haven't subscribed, please do so if you like the content. And of course, a huge shout out to all of our current patrons and channel members. Thank you all so much for all of your support and everything that you do. So of course, a thank you to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven van Nimwegen, Patty Wack, Richard, Devin Purser, Brian Haney, Keegan Tawney, and Elias Meza. So to all of you, thank you all again for all of your support. And if you would like to join that amazing list of people, please do check out our Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member. So with all of those shout outs out of the way, let's move on to the actual gameplay and see how this deck performs in a game. So, starting off with our opponents, this week we are joined by Vintage in his very first game on the channel, playing Gerard, Weatherlight Hero. We have Josh playing Karazakar, the Eye Tyrant, and we have Doodle playing the 4th Doctor and Perry Brown. So starting off with Vintage and his Gerard deck, Vintage very recently joined the Dungeon Learners Guide Discord and wanted to put together a deck with the help of everybody in the Discord. So he kind of put together a list of cards he had sitting around his house, and we as a group collectively built this Gerard deck. So I think it's a very cool concept for a deck. I know he's very proud of it, and I know that it's a deck that pretty much everyone in the Discord has a little bit of an attachment to because we all helped get it to its current state. And this is its initial and inaugural, I suppose, outing. So hopefully we get to see some of the cool synergies he's got in there. I'm a big fan of Gerard as a commander. We actually built a Boros Morph deck a while back around Gerard, so if you're interested in that, please do go check it out. But like I said, I'm excited to see what is going on. Moving on, we have Josh and his Karazakar deck, and this is kind of a goad style deck. He did mention that there is goad in it, but that he wanted to steer clear of a ton of different goad effects. He really just wanted to try to incentivize his opponents to attack each other, to not necessarily take away that choice, but to really give them a reason to want to attack his opponents rather than attacking Josh. And I think that is a very cool concept. And I'm also well aware of how good Rakdos can be at forcing combat. So I think out of all the decks at the table, this is probably the one that I am the most concerned about. Let me know down in the comments if you disagree. But moving on to our final opponent, we have Doodle playing the 4th Doctor and Perry Brown. So the 4th Doctor is caring about casting historic spells from the top of his library, and Perry Brown is giving historic spells Convoke. So he really wants to just cast as many historic spells as possible. And you may be wondering what historic spells he's casting. Well, he calls this his Doctor deck. This has every Doctor Who companion and Doctor that he's able to squeeze into the actual deck. So in a way, it's like Doctor or Time Lord, maybe Kindred, which I think is a very cool concept. I'm not 100% sure how it's going to work. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I'm not as up to date on the Doctor Who cards as some other people may be, so I'm not 100% sure what to expect out of this deck, but I do think it's going to be a ton of fun. And I think that there's going to be a lot of synergies that I may not expect. And knowing Doodle, I'm sure he's got some surprises in this deck as well. So let me know down in the comments who you think is going to wind up winning our game. Get those predictions in now, and then let me know if you were correct by the end of the game. So with all that being said, I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. I hope you will enjoy the game. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Vintage, Josh, and then Doodle. On my first turn, I play an irrigated farmland. Vintage plays a mountain and casts a Soul Ring. Josh plays a mountain. Doodle plays a Path of Ancestry. I play a command tower and cast Sanctum Weaver. Vintage plays a Plains and casts Empowered Auto-Generator, which gets a counter whenever it's tapped and then adds mana of any color equal to the number of counters on it. Josh plays a Swamp, then casts Arcane Signet. Doodle plays a secluded courtyard, naming Doctor when it enters, then casts Bloom Tender. I play a Plains and cast my commander, Ishai Ojutai Dragonspeaker, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever an opponent casts a spell. Vintage plays a Myriad Landscape, then casts Ghostly Prison, putting a counter on Ishai and making each opponent pay 2 mana per creature to attack him. Josh plays a Sulphurous Springs and casts Nettling Nuisance, giving a player a 4/2 pirate token that's goaded and can't block whenever it deals combat damage to that player. Doodle plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Doctor, and casts his commander, Perry Brown, giving the first historic spell he casts each turn, Convoke. I play a Forest, then I move to combat attacking Doodle for 4 with Ishai, and in my second main phase I cast Setessan Champion, which gets a +1/+1 counter and lets me draw a card whenever an enchantment enters under my control. Vintage casts his commander, Gerard Weatherlight Hero, then plays a Boros Garrison, returning a mountain to his hand. Josh plays a mountain and casts Curse of Hospitality, enchanting me, giving all creatures that attack me trample, and also letting a player exile the top card of my library when they deal combat damage to me, being able to play the exiled card until the end of turn. This lets him attack me for 3, giving me a pirate token and exiling a Fertile Ground from the top of my library, which Josh casts in his second main phase, enchanting his mountain so that it taps for an additional mana of any color. Doodle plays a Yavimaya Cradle of Growth, turning all lands into forests in addition to their other types, then casts the 6th Doctor, letting him copy a historic spell that he casts, but only once each turn. This lets him cast a Soul Ring, copying it when he casts it. On my turn, I cast a Boon of the Spirit Realm, getting a Blessing counter whenever it or another enchantment enters under my control, then giving my creatures +1/+1 for each counter on it. This also triggers Setessan Champion, giving it a +1/+1 counter and letting me draw a card. Then I move to combat, attacking Doodle for 5 with the Pirate and Josh for 10 with Ishai. Vintage plays a mountain and casts Chandra Awakened Inferno, immediately activating her +2 ability to give each of his opponents an emblem that does 1 damage to them in their upkeep. He then attacks Josh for 3 with Gerard, and in his second main phase, Vintage sacrifices his Myriad Landscape, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them both into play tapped. On Josh's turn, he takes a damage, plays an Exotic Orchard, and casts Liquimetal Torque. He then also casts his commander Karazakar the Eye Tyrant, letting him tap and goad a creature when he attacks a player, and whenever one of his opponents attacks another of his opponents, both Josh and the attacking player draw a card and lose a life. He then attacks me for 3 with Nettling Nuisance, goading Ishai, letting me make another pirate, and having me exile Enchantress's Presence from the top of my library, which he doesn't cast. In Doodle's upkeep, he takes a damage, then casts the 5th Doctor, creating a non-legendary copy of it, letting him put a +1/+1 counter on each creature he controls in his end step that didn't attack or enter this turn. After that, he casts his commander, the 4th Doctor. This lets him look at the top card of his library at any time and play a historic spell from the top of his library once a turn, making a food token when he does so. Finally, he casts the 7th Doctor, letting him choose a card in his hand when he attacks, and having defending player guess if its mana value is greater than the number of artifacts he controls. If they guess correctly, he investigates, and if they guess wrong, he casts the spell for free. At the end of turn, Doodle untaps Bloom Tender, Piper, and the 6th Doctor, putting 2 +1/+1 counters on them. Then, since Bloom Tender is untapped, this lets Doodle tap it again to cast Crib Swap, exiling Ishai and giving me a 1/1 Changeling token. In my upkeep, I take a damage and cast Frogify, enchanting Perry Brown, so that she's a 1/1 frog with no abilities. This also puts a second Blessing counter on my boon, puts a +1/+1 counter on Setessan Champion, and lets me draw a card. After that, I play a Thorn Glint Bridge and cast Reprobation, enchanting the 6th Doctor, turning it into a 0/1 coward with no abilities, again triggering Boon, putting another counter on it, putting a +1/+1 counter on Setessan Champion, and drawing a card. After that, I cast Morbid Opportunist, letting me draw a card once a turn whenever a creature dies, and I attack Doodle for 14 with both pirates, letting Josh and I both draw a card and lose a life. Doodle blocks with his frog and coward, killing them both, letting me draw a card while he takes no damage. Vintage plays a Plains and casts Phyrexian Rebirth, destroying all creatures and making a 14/14 Phyrexian Horror creature token since 14 creatures died this way, while I also get to draw a card. Once that resolves, he activates Chandra's +2 ability, giving each of his opponents another emblem, and casts Elesh Norn, making an opponent lose 2 life when they deal damage to him or his permanents unless they pay a mana. In Josh's upkeep, he takes 2 damage, then he plays a Luxury Suite, and recasts his commander, Karazakar. In Doodle's upkeep, he takes 2 damage, and recasts his commander, the 4th Doctor. In my upkeep, I take 2 damage, then I play a Sunken Hollow and cast Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size, and also cast Ashiok's Reaper, drawing a card whenever an enchantment I control is put into the graveyard from play. On Vintage's turn, he activates Chandra's +2 ability, giving each of his opponents another emblem, then casts Sephara the Sky's Blade, giving his other flying creatures indestructible. He moves to combat and attacks Doodle for 14, letting himself and Josh both draw a card and lose a life. Then Doodle blocks with the 4th Doctor, killing it but taking no damage. In his second main phase, Vintage recast his commander, Gerard. In Josh's upkeep, he takes 3 damage, then he plays a Swamp and casts Sangromancer, letting him gain 3 life whenever an opponent discards a card or whenever an opponent's creature dies. He then moves to combat, attacking Doodle for 5, goading the horror token on attacks. Notably, Karazakar can only goad a creature that defending player controls, so he would have had to have attacked Vintage for this, but we don't catch that at the time. In his second main phase, Josh casts Protection Racket, so in his upkeep, he exiles the top card of his library for each opponent, putting it into his hand unless that opponent pays life equal to its mana value. In Doodle's upkeep, he takes 3 damage, then casts the 2nd Doctor, giving each player no maximum hand size. Then when he moves to his end step, each player may draw a card, but for each player that does, they can't attack Doodle on their next turn. Once that's resolved, he casts Irenicus's Vile Duplication, creating a non-legendary token copy of the 2nd Doctor. This means that when he moves to his end step, both copies trigger, with each player except Vintage drawing 2 cards and preventing everyone but Vintage from attacking Doodle on their next turn. On my turn, I take 3 damage, play a Plains, and cast a Mesa Enchantress, drawing a card whenever I cast an enchantment. I also cast an Elvish Archivist, drawing a card once a turn when an enchantment enters under my control, or putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it once a turn when an artifact enters under my control. Finally, I cast Song of the Dryads, enchanting Elesh Norn, turning her into a forest, while I draw 2 cards and put another counter on Boon of the Spirit Realm. On Vintage's turn, he activates Chandra's +2 ability, giving each of his opponents another emblem, then plays a mountain, casts a Hedron Archive, immediately sacrificing it to draw 2 cards, and then casts Dockside Extortionist, making 13 treasure tokens when it enters, since his opponents control 13 artifacts and enchantments. With the treasures, he's able to cast Discerning Financier, letting him make a treasure in his upkeep if an opponent controls more lands than he does, and also letting him pay 3 mana to give control of one of his treasures to an opponent so he can draw a card. He immediately does so, giving a treasure to Doodle and drawing a card. He then moves to combat and attacks me for 21 with the Horror and Sephara, both of which get trample from Josh's curse, then Josh and Vintage both draw a card and lose a life. I block the Horror with Ashiok's Reaper, killing it and still taking 14 damage before exiling Tanglepool Bridge and Triumphant Reckoning from the top of my library. In Vintage's second main phase, he casts a Talpa Primal Dawn. In Josh's upkeep, he takes 4 damage, then Protection Racket triggers, with Doodle putting Hot Pursuit into Josh's hand, while Vintage and I both exile lands by paying 0 life. Josh then casts Sawhorn Nemesis, choosing Vintage when it enters, so all damage dealt to him and his permanents is doubled. Finally, he casts a Vampire Nighthawk and passes. In Doodle's upkeep, he takes 4 damage, plays a Plains, then casts Quantum Misentanglement, making another copy of the Second Doctor. Then at the end of turn, all 3 copies of the Second Doctor trigger, with each player choosing to draw 3, so none of Doodle's opponents can attack him on their next turn. In my upkeep, I take 4 damage, then I play a Forest and cast Grave Betrayal, making it so that whenever one of my opponent's creatures dies, it returns to the battlefield under my control with a +1/+1 counter. Since it's also an enchantment, I draw 2 cards and put another counter on the boon. After that, I cast Darksteel Mutation, enchanting Zetalpa, turning him into a 0/1 indestructible insect with no other abilities, while I draw a card and put another counter on the boon. Vintage plays a Plains and casts another round for X=2, exiling all his creatures and returning them to the battlefield a total of 3 times. In response though, Doodle casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Dockside Extortionist and letting Vintage gain 1 life. Then another round resolves, blinking the rest of Vintage's creatures 3 times, but since none of them have entered the battlefield effects, all it does is knock the Darksteel Mutation off of Zetalpa. Once that resolves, he activates Chandra's +2 ability, giving each of his opponents another emblem, then he activates Discerning Financier, giving a treasure to me and drawing a card. He also casts a Tectonic Giant, letting him do 3 damage to each opponent or exile the top 2 cards of his library, being able to play one until the end of turn, whenever the giant attacks or becomes the target of a spell that an opponent controls. Once that's resolved, he moves to combat and attacks me for 7 with Sephara and Josh for 14 with the Horror. This triggers Karazakar, letting Josh and Vintage both draw a card and lose a life, then Josh blocks with Vampire Nighthawk, killing it and the Horror and returning the Nighthawk to play under my control with a +1/+1 counter at the end of turn. This means that Josh takes no damage and actually gains 4, while I take 7 and exile a Plains from the top of my library. In his second main phase, Vintage cast a Commander Sphere, as well as a Loxodon Life Chanter, choosing not to have his life total become equal to the total toughness of his creatures when it enters. In Josh's upkeep, he takes 5 damage and triggers Protection Racket, putting a Mountain and a Prisoner's Dilemma into his hand, while Vintage pays 0 life to exile Blightstep Pathway. He then casts Life of the Party, letting each opponent make a token copy of it, and it gets +X+0 when it attacks, where X is the number of creatures its controller has, and the token copies are all goated. He also casts Hot Pursuit, suspecting Zetalpa, so it gains Menace, can no longer block, and is goated. Then, Josh also casts Vengeful Ancestor, goading the Loxodon Life Chanter when it enters, and doing 1 damage to a player when a goated creature they control attacks. In Doodle's upkeep, he takes 5 damage and casts Quantum Misentanglement with Rebound, creating yet another copy of the Second Doctor. He then plays a Command Tower and attacks me for 5 with the goated Life of the Party, drawing Josh and Doodle both a card and making them lose a life. Then I block with the Nighthawk, killing the token, taking no damage and gaining 9 life. In his second main phase, Doodle casts Relic of Legends, letting his legendary creatures tap for a mana of any color, and then also recasts his commander Perry Brown. At the end of turn, we all draw 4 cards with the Second Doctor, meaning nobody can attack Doodle on their next turn. In my upkeep, I take 5 damage, then I cast a Wild Growth, enchanting a forest so that it taps for an additional mana. This puts another counter on the boon, and lets me draw 2 cards. Once that's resolved, I cast Heliod's Intervention for X=1, destroying Vintage's Ghostly Prison. I also cast All That Glitters, enchanting Vampire Nighthawk, giving it +X+X, where X is the number of artifacts and enchantments I control, which is currently 6. This also puts a counter on the boon and draws me another card. After that, I play an island and cast Martyr's Bond, so whenever a non-land permanent I control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a permanent that shares a card type with it. This puts another counter on the boon and draws me another card. I move to combat, attacking Vintage for 33 with the Nighthawk and Life of the Party, and I attack Josh for 22 with the Archivist and the Enchantress. On attacks, Josh and I both draw a card and lose a life, then Vintage blocks with his Loxodon, Gerard, and Tectonic Giant, while Josh blocks with Vengeful Ancestor and Life of the Party. This kills all blocking creatures, returning them to the battlefield under my control in the next end step with a +1/+1 counter, while Josh takes no damage, Vintage takes 40, and I gain 40 life. Notably, since Gerard dies here, Vintage exiles him from his graveyard to return all artifacts and creatures from his graveyard to the battlefield that died this turn. Josh's Sangromancer also triggers, gaining him a total of 9 life. At this point, when Vintage's Loxodon returns to play, he can have his life total become equal to the total toughness of creatures he controls, so he does, going back to 29 life. Finally, at the end of turn, Doodle flashes in Wrath Capuchin, Ship's Mage, giving his historic spells flash. Also at the end of turn, I put Vengeful Ancestor and Life of the Party into play under my control, giving each opponent a copy of the Life of the Party and goading Sephara. On Vintage's turn, he activates Chandra's +2 ability, giving each opponent another emblem, then plays a Plains and casts Devil's Play for X equals 22, doing 22 damage to Josh. He then attacks me for 19 with Zetalpa, Tectonic Giant, and Life of the Party, and attacks Josh for 14 with Sephara and the other Life of the Party. On attacks, Tectonic Giant does 3 damage to each of Vintage's opponents, then Josh and Vintage both draw a card and lose a life, while Vintage takes an additional 8 damage for attacking with 4 goaded creatures. Josh blocks all but 1 of the damage going at him, losing his Sangromancer, Karazakar, and Life of the Party in the process, while I block the Giant, killing it and taking 15 damage. Then at the end of turn, all of my opponent's creatures that died this turn return to play under my control with a +1/+1 counter. Also at the end of turn, Doodle flashes in Reiki the History of Kamigawa, letting him draw a card whenever he casts a legendary spell. In Josh's upkeep, he casts Backlash, tapping Zetalpa and having it do damage equal to its power to its controller, doing a total of 8 damage to Vintage. Then he also casts Chaos Warp, shuffling Chandra into Vintage's library and letting him reveal the top card of his library, putting it into play if it's a permanent, which it is, putting Backdraft Hellkite into play. Then Josh takes 6 damage from his Chandra emblems, knocking him out of the game. Notably, when Josh dies, I also lose control of all of his creatures that I controlled. In Doodle's upkeep, he flashes in his commander, the 4th Doctor, drawing a card, but unfortunately this isn't enough to save him, as he still takes the 6 damage from his Chandra emblems, knocking him out of the game as well. In my upkeep, I take 6 damage, then play an island, and cast Overwhelming Splendor, enchanting Vintage, turning all his creatures into 1/1s with no abilities. This puts another counter on Boon of the Spirit Realm, and lets me draw 2 cards. I move to combat, attacking Vintage with my entire board for 50 damage, doing 3 damage on attacks with Tectonic Giant. Vintage blocks everything but the Life of the Party, going to only 2 life. Notably, this should have killed all 3 of his blocking creatures and put them into play under my control, including the Loxodon Life Chanter, meaning I could have set my life total to 90, but we unfortunately forget that. In my second main phase, I cast Omen of the Hunt, searching my library for a basic land and putting it into play. Then, on Vintage's turn, he's able to simply flash back Devil's Play for X equals 22, doing 22 damage to me, knocking me out, and winning Vintage the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Everyone's deck kind of got to do their thing, which I think was a ton of fun, and that always makes for a good game. So, starting off with, we'll say Josh, I think that the goad deck and forcing people to attack each other worked very well. I think he got a little bit unlucky that he kind of had to keep blocking with some of his creatures and losing out on some important synergy pieces. But I think the deck itself performed well. I think that if he'd had a couple more turns of goading things and of making sure that he was one of the last 2 people standing, I think Hot Pursuit probably could have won him the game. But unfortunately, that wasn't quite the case, so hopefully we'll get to see Karazakar again in the future. Moving on to Doodle, he also got a little bit unfortunate having to block a lot with his doctors and not really use them for their intended purpose. However, by the end of the game, if it weren't for the Chandra emblems, I do think Doodle probably would have been the winner, given the fact that he was drawing 4 cards a turn, and even if his opponents were also drawing 4 cards a turn, that meant that they couldn't attack him, and I think that he was just kind of setting himself up because I'll be perfectly honest, I was probably always going to draw those cards. I had no intention of attacking Doodle at any point. So definitely a cool setup. We just didn't get to see him execute the final game plan. Our deck, I think, did very well. I think that we were in a position to win, and like you heard me mention in the actual gameplay, there was a mistake at the end where we missed that Vintage's creatures should have died and therefore should have gained me a bunch of life with the Loxodon Life Chanter, but we didn't catch that, and it did wind up changing the ending of the game, which I mentioned to Vintage and the rest of the Discord afterwards, and he was a little upset with himself that he missed that, but of course, not his fault. We all missed it in the game. So I do want to apologize for the mistake that was made because it did affect the outcome of the game, but I do think the ending was still a ton of fun, and I think that our deck really showed how consistent it can be and how resilient it can be by just keep coming back, keep putting more creatures into play. Grave Betrayal really did turn out to be an MVP in this game, so I was very happy to see it pop off. And then, of course, our winner, we got to talk about Vintage and his deck. It was very cool to see the deck that we as a Discord designed just kind of slowly grinding out value over the course of the game. I was very impressed by Empowered Auto Generator being able to just, well, generate a ton of mana over the course of the game. Turns out getting down a 4-drop mana rock on turn 2 tends to be pretty good, and I do think that that combined with the turn 1 Soul Ring did make a difference. But I don't think it made enough of a difference to say that he ran away with the game in the way that we kind of expected given the quick start. So a very cool game, a very good showing by everybody's decks. I'm very happy with this game. I think our deck, like I said, performed very well, and I'm glad to see that the deck that we built on stream did kind of what we wanted it to do. If you're interested in any other streams in the future where we build a deck together, please do let me know, because that is something I've been thinking about doing, but I haven't quite done it, just because I'm not sure if people really want to see it. So if that is something you're interested in, please do let me know so I can go ahead and set those up. Otherwise, though, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you for liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and thank you for all of your support. So without any further ado, I appreciate all of you, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.